The night was unnaturally quiet, the kind of silence that presses on your ears and makes you hyper-aware of every sound. I had stayed up late, scrolling through my phone in bed. The dim glow from the screen was the only light in the room, and outside the wind whispered through the trees. I didn't think much of it at first. Nights like these were common in our small, isolated town. It was around 3 a.m. when I first heard the tapping. A faint, deliberate sound like fingernails against glass. I froze, my thumb hovering over my phone. I told myself it was probably just a tree branch scraping against the window. The logical explanation calmed me for a moment. But then I remembered. There were no trees near my window. My heart started to pound as the tapping continued, soft but insistent. I wanted to ignore it, to pretend it wasn't happening, but something about the rhythm felt wrong. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. Like someone, or something, wanted my attention. I sat up slowly, my throat dry and tight. The room felt colder, and I could see my breath in the faint light. My eyes darted to the window, but the curtains were drawn. I couldn't see anything. For a moment I thought about calling out for my parents, but I didn't want to wake them over what might just be my imagination. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Summoning every ounce of courage, I slid out of bed and tiptoed toward the window. My hand trembled as I reached for the edge of the curtain. The tapping stopped. The sudden silence was worse than the sound. I hesitated, my heart racing so loudly it drowned out my thoughts. Slowly, I pulled the curtain back. At first, I saw nothing but my reflection in the glass, pale and wide-eyed. Then, as my eyes adjusted to the darkness outside, I saw it. A face. It was pressed against the window, just inches from my own. Its skin was pale and cracked, like porcelain left in the cold for too long. Its eyes were hollow, dark pits that seemed to pull me in. The mouth was stretched into an unnatural grin, showing jagged yellow teeth. I stumbled backward, knocking over a lamp. The crash echoed through the room, and I scrambled to my feet, my chest heaving. When I dared to look back at the window, the face was gone. But the frost on the glass had smeared where it had been, as if something cold and wet had pressed against it. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat curled up in the corner of my bed, clutching my phone, but I didn't dare call anyone. Who would believe me? When morning finally came, I mustered the courage to check the window. There were faint smudges on the outside, marks that looked like finger streaks. But that wasn't the worst part. On the windowsill, etched faintly into the frost, was a message. See you tonight. I moved out of that house a month later, but even now, I can't sleep near a window. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I think I can still hear that tapping, soft and insistent, just waiting for me to look. It started on a cold, stormy night. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and the rain came down in heavy sheets. I was home alone, curled up on the couch, watching an old horror movie. The house felt bigger than usual, the silence pressing in between the bursts of thunder. I told myself it was just the weather making me uneasy. That was until the knock. At first, it was faint, like someone lightly tapping on wood. I paused the movie, listening. It came again. 3 soft knocks. My heart skipped a beat. I glanced at the front door, but it was locked, and the porch light showed nothing but rain outside. I stood up slowly, telling myself it was just the storm playing tricks. But then I realized something chilling. The sound wasn't coming from the front door. It was coming from the basement. The knock came again, louder this time, echoing up the stairs. My blood turned cold. I didn't use the basement much, just for storage. The thought of anyone or anything being down there made my skin crawl. I tried to convince myself it was just a loose pipe or the wind, but deep down, I knew better. Gripping my phone tightly, I crept toward the basement door. My fingers trembled as I reached for the handle. I hesitated, my mind racing with every possible explanation. Another knock, sharp and deliberate, made me jump back. It sounded too human. I whispered to myself, "Don't open it. Don't open it." But something compelled me. Slowly, I twisted the knob and pulled the door open. The stairs stretched down into darkness, the air cold and damp. My flashlight flickered as I pointed it into the abyss. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaky. Silence. I stepped onto the top stair, the wood creaking under my weight. My heart pounded in my ears as I descended. Halfway down, I froze. A single knock came again, but this time, it wasn't from the bottom. It was from behind me. I spun around, shining the flashlight wildly. The basement door at the top of the stairs was now closed. My chest tightened as I bolted back up, grabbing the doorknob. It wouldn't budge. The knock started again, louder, more frantic, as if someone, or something, was on the other side. "Let me out!" I screamed, banging on the door. Then everything went still. The silence was worse than the noise. I could hear my own breathing, sharp and uneven. I turned back toward the basement, the darkness swallowing the light of my flashlight. And that's when I saw it. A figure stood at the bottom of the stairs, barely visible in the faint beam of light. It was tall, its limbs unnaturally long, and its head tilted to one side. Its eyes glowed faintly, 2 pinpricks of light in the dark. A grin stretched across its pale face, too wide, too sharp. It started to climb the stairs. I pounded on the door, screaming for help, but no one was there to hear me. The thing's footsteps were slow and deliberate, each one louder than the last. It stopped just inches from me, its face so close I could feel its icy breath. The last thing I remember was its hand reaching out, long fingers curling around my wrist. Then, everything went black. When I woke up, I was in my living room. The storm had passed, and the house was quiet. The basement door was open, swinging gently on its hinges. But something was different. On the inside of the door, there were scratches, deep, jagged marks, as if someone had been clawing to get out. And written above them in what looked like dried blood were 3 words: "You let me." It started on a quiet night, the kind of silence that makes you feel uneasy for no reason. I was sitting on the couch watching an old movie when I heard it, a low creak coming from the hallway. At first I thought it was just the house settling. Old houses make noises, right? But then it came again, louder this time, like wood groaning under pressure. I muted the TV and listened. My heart started to race as I realized the sound was coming from the basement. I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe a draft or a loose hinge. Still, I couldn't shake the cold feeling creeping up my spine. Gathering my courage, I walked to the hallway. The basement door stood at the end, slightly ajar. I knew for a fact it had been closed. I always made sure to lock it. Something about basements made me nervous, even though I'd lived in this house for years. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no answer, just the faint sound of something shifting below, like a box being dragged. My pulse quickened. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, its beam shaky as I pointed it toward the door. Slowly, I stepped closer, each creak of the floorboards making my stomach twist. The door was fully open now, swinging gently as if inviting me in. I stared at the dark stairway leading down, my hand gripping the banister. "It's just your imagination," I whispered to myself. But the air felt wrong, heavy, cold, and thick, like I was being watched. I forced myself to take the first step, the wooden plank groaning under my weight. The beam of light from my phone barely pierced the darkness. As I descended, the smell hit me, a damp, musty odor, mixed with something metallic, like old blood. Halfway down, I froze. There was something at the bottom of the stairs crouched in the shadows. My light caught the faint outline of a figure, too thin, with limbs that seemed unnaturally long. It wasn't moving, but I could hear its breathing, shallow, raspy, like it was struggling to hold itself together. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My legs felt like lead as I tried to back up the stairs. That's when it moved. Slowly, its head turned toward me. 2 pale, milky eyes stared up, empty and lifeless, and its mouth twisted into a crooked grin. "Why did you open the door?" it rasped, its voice like dry leaves scraping against stone. I stumbled, nearly dropping my phone as I scrambled backward. It started to climb the stairs, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet with tangled strings. I turned and ran, slamming the door behind me and locking it. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the key. The house fell silent again, but I didn't feel safe. I pressed my ear to the door, straining to hear. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, slowly, deliberately, a knock echoed from the other side. It's been 3 days since that night. I haven't gone near the basement door, but sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear it creak open again, and I know it's waiting for me. The house had been empty for years, its windows like hollow eyes staring at anyone brave enough to pass. But for reasons I still can't explain, my family decided to move in. My parents called it quaint and full of character, but to me, it felt wrong from the moment we unlocked the creaky front door. The first night was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that makes your ears strain for a sound, any sound, just to prove you're not trapped in some dream. I lay in bed, staring at the peeling ceiling, trying to ignore the icy chill that seemed to seep through the walls. Then, it started. At first I thought it was the wind, a soft whisper, barely audible, brushing against my ears. I sat up, clutching the blankets, my heart thumping in my chest. It's just the house settling, I whispered to myself, trying to stay calm. But the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, clearer, like voices murmuring just behind the walls. The whispers were too faint to understand, but they were there. No mistake about it. I wanted to call for my parents, but something told me not to. It felt like the voices didn't want to be heard by anyone else, like they were meant only for me. The next morning I tried to tell my mom, but she waved it off. Old houses make noises, she said, her hands busy unpacking dishes. I didn't push it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The walls weren't just making noise, they were alive. That night the whispers came back stronger than before. They seemed to move around the room, circling me, closing in. I pressed my ear to the wall, trembling, trying to make out the words. And then, I heard it. A name. My name. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet. The whispers turned into soft giggles, cold and mocking, echoing around me. My breath came in short gasps, and my hands shook as I fumbled to turn on the light. The bulb flickered but stayed on, casting long shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking. I didn't sleep that night. The days blurred together after that. Every time I was alone in the house, the whispers followed me. Sometimes they sounded angry, hissing and low. Other times, they were almost playful, like children playing hide and seek. But the worst part was the feeling, the cold, creeping sensation of being watched, always watched. One evening as the sun dipped below the horizon, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and went to the basement, where the whispers seemed loudest. The air grew colder with each step, and the beam of light shook as I gripped the flashlight tightly. The basement was empty, just bare concrete walls and an old, dusty furnace. But the whispers were deafening now, swirling around me, filling my head. And then I saw it. A crack in the wall, just big enough for something to slip through. As I moved closer, the whispers stopped. The silence was worse than the noise. My hand trembled as I reached out to touch the crack, and the wall shifted. It wasn't concrete. It was soft, almost like skin, and it pulsed beneath my fingers. A scream tore from my throat as a hand shot out of the crack, skeletal and covered in decayed flesh. I dropped the flashlight and it shattered, plunging the room into darkness. The whispers exploded around me, a cacophony of rage and laughter as I scrambled up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind me. We moved out the next day. My parents thought it was because I'd imagined something, but I know the truth. The house is still there, waiting, the whispers growing louder, calling for someone else to listen. And I pray no one ever does. I always sleep with my door locked. It's a habit I've had since I was a kid. I don't know why, but I've always felt safer that way. Like the locked door was a barrier between me and whatever might be lurking in the dark. But that night, the lock didn't matter. I woke up suddenly, my heart racing for no reason. The room was silent, too silent, and I could feel that something was wrong. The air felt heavy and my skin prickled with unease. I lay there for a moment, trying to convince myself it was nothing, just a bad dream. But then I felt it. Someone was watching me. I turned my head slowly toward the corner of the room, where the faint glow of the streetlight outside barely reached. That's when I saw him. A man, standing perfectly still, his face hidden in the shadows. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't see his eyes, but I could feel them, locked onto me. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Maybe it was a shadow, a trick of the light. But then he moved. Just a slight tilt of his head, almost like he was studying me. My chest tightened, and I froze, afraid that even the slightest movement would make him come closer. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't cooperate. My mind raced. How did he get in? The door was locked, the windows were closed. None of it made sense. The man took a step forward, and the dim light caught part of his face. His skin was pale, almost gray, and stretched tight over his cheekbones. His lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't a normal smile. It was too wide, too sharp, like it didn't belong on a human face. "You're awake," he said softly, his voice low and raspy, like dry leaves scraping against pavement. My stomach churned. I wanted to ask who he was, what he wanted, but the words wouldn't come out. He took another step, and the floorboards creaked under his weight. Slowly, he raised a hand and pointed to the bed. "Do you know how long I've been watching you?" he asked, his voice almost playful. "You sleep so peacefully, it's fascinating." Tears welled in my eyes, and my hands gripped the blanket tightly, as if it could somehow protect me. He tilted his head again, as if amused by my fear. "Don't worry," he said. "I'm not here to hurt you. I just like to watch." Suddenly, I heard a loud banging sound from downstairs. It was so abrupt, so jarring, that it snapped me out of my frozen state. The man's head whipped toward the door, and in that moment I scrambled out of bed and bolted for the hallway. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it would burst. I ran to the kitchen and grabbed a knife, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it. I waited, holding my breath, expecting him to follow. But when I worked up the courage to check my room, it was empty. No sign of him. The door was still locked, just as I'd left it. I didn't sleep for days after that. Even now, years later, I still can't close my eyes without seeing his face. Sometimes when I'm alone, I get the feeling he's still there, somewhere in the shadows, watching, waiting. When my grandmother passed away, she left me her favorite doll. It was old, with faded clothes and glassy, unblinking eyes. The doll had always creeped me out as a kid, but I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. It felt wrong, like I'd be disrespecting her memory. So I put it on a shelf in my bedroom and tried to ignore it. The first night, I woke up to a faint sound. It was soft, like something scraping across the wooden floor. My heart raced as I sat up in bed and scanned the room. The moonlight streaming through the window cast strange shadows, but nothing seemed out of place. The doll sat exactly where I'd left it, staring blankly into the room. I told myself it was just my imagination, and went back to sleep. The next morning, I noticed something strange. The doll wasn't sitting upright anymore. It was slumped forward, its head tilted as if it had been looking at something on the floor. I convinced myself I must have bumped the shelf without realizing it. Still, I felt uneasy, like those glassy eyes were following me. That night, I woke up again. This time, the sound was louder, a distinct thump, followed by the soft creak of floorboards. I froze, gripping the blanket tightly as I listened. The noise was coming from near the shelf. Slowly, I turned my head, and my stomach dropped. The doll wasn't there. I bit my lip to keep from screaming. My mind raced with explanations. Maybe I'd moved it earlier and forgotten? But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Summoning all my courage, I reached for my phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam swept across the room, and that's when I saw it. The doll was on the floor, sitting upright with its legs bent in an unnatural way. Its head was turned, those lifeless eyes staring directly at me. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. My hands shook as I got out of bed and picked it up. Its body felt colder than it should have, like it had been left outside in the frost. I placed it back on the shelf and whispered, "Stay there," as if it could hear me. That night I barely slept, every noise making my heart race. By morning I was exhausted, but the doll was still on the shelf, exactly where I'd left it. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it all. Maybe the stress of losing my grandmother was getting to me. But that evening when I came back from school, the doll was on my bed. My blood ran cold. I knew for a fact I hadn't touched it since the night before. That night, I locked the doll in the closet, shoving it behind a pile of old clothes. But as I lay in bed, the noises started again. This time, it wasn't just thumps or creaks. I heard faint laughter, high-pitched and chilling, coming from the closet. My chest tightened, and tears streamed down my face as I pressed my hands over my ears, willing the sound to stop. The next morning, the closet door was open. The doll sat in the middle of the room, its head tilted, its grin wider than I remembered. I left the house that day and never went back. Sometimes late at night I still hear that faint, high-pitched laughter, as if the doll was letting me know it hasn't forgotten me. The mirror hung in the hallway of our old house, a tall antique thing with an ornate golden frame. It had been there for as long as I could remember, but I never liked it. There was something unsettling about how it caught the light, making the reflection seem darker, almost alive. One night as I passed by on my way to bed, I caught a glimpse of something. At first I thought it was just my reflection, but then I realized it wasn't moving the way I was. My reflection's head turned slightly to the side, even though mine didn't. I froze, staring into the glass, my breath caught in my chest. My reflection tilted its head further, and for a moment I thought I saw it smile. I backed away slowly, telling myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the dim light. But when I turned to leave, the sound of faint tapping stopped me. It was soft, like nails tapping on glass. I turned back to the mirror, and there it was again, my reflection. But it wasn't me. It stood still, staring at me with hollow, dark eyes. Its hand was pressed against the inside of the glass as if trying to break through. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, and ran to my room. I shut the door, but the feeling didn't leave me. It felt like the air in the house had changed, heavier somehow, pressing down on me. I climbed into bed and pulled the blanket over my head, trying to forget what I'd seen. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The next morning, I told my mom about the mirror, but she brushed it off. "It's an old mirror," she said. "They can play tricks on the eyes." But I knew what I'd seen. I avoided the hallway after that, always taking the long way around. Still, I could feel it, like the mirror was calling to me, pulling at the edges of my mind. A week later, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, moving down the hallway. My room was dark, the only light coming from the sliver beneath the door. I sat up in bed, holding my breath, listening. The footsteps stopped, replaced by that same tapping sound. It was coming from the hallway, from the mirror. I couldn't help myself, I had to see. I crept to the door and cracked it open, just enough to peek out. The hallway was empty, but the mirror, it was glowing faintly, a soft, eerie light that made my stomach churn. My reflection was there, but it wasn't alone. Behind it, a shadowy figure loomed, tall and featureless, with long, spindly fingers that pressed against the glass. The figure leaned closer, and my reflection smiled, a wide, unnatural grin that sent chills down my spine. I slammed the door and locked it, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the key. The tapping grew louder, more frantic, like something trying to break free. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, the mirror was gone. My mom said she sold it to a collector, someone who loved old, haunted things. I didn't ask any more questions. But sometimes, when I pass by shiny surfaces, I swear I see that grin, waiting for me to notice. It started with a dare. My friends and I were walking past the old Grayson Hotel, the one everyone in town said was haunted. It had been abandoned for decades, but there were always stories about screams heard at night or strange shadows in the windows. The kind of stories no one really believed, but no one wanted to test either. Except for Jake. He always had to be the brave one. "Let's check out room 306, he said with a grin. "That's where they say people go in but never come out." The others laughed nervously, but I didn't. Something about the way the hotel loomed in the dark, its broken windows staring like empty eyes, made me want to turn back. But I didn't want to be the coward, so I followed. The lobby was worse than I imagined. Dusty, dark, and silent, except for the sound of our footsteps. The air felt heavy, like it hadn't been touched in years. Jake led the way, flashlight in hand, as we climbed the creaking staircase. Each step felt like it might give way. When we reached the third floor, the air was colder. We found the door to room 306 halfway down the hall. It was slightly ajar, and the plaque was so old the numbers were barely readable. Jake pushed the door open and we stepped inside. The room was surprisingly clean, almost untouched. The bed was made, the curtains were drawn, and there was a faint smell of something sweet, like flowers that had been left too long. But it didn't feel right. The walls seemed to close in, and the silence was so deep it felt alive. We spread out, looking around. Jake laughed, pretending to be scared, but I could see the tension in his face. I walked toward the window, my breath fogging up the glass. That's when I noticed the writing on the mirror above the dresser. It was faint, like someone had traced it with a finger. "Don't look behind you." My heart stopped. I wanted to scream, but my throat tightened. Slowly, against every instinct in my body, I turned around. The room was empty, or so I thought. Then I saw it. In the corner, just out of the flashlight's reach, a figure stood. It was tall and thin, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its eyes glowed faintly, two pinpricks of light in the darkness. It didn't move, but I could feel it watching me. "Guys," I whispered, but my voice cracked. No one answered. I turned to look for them, but they were gone. The door to the room was shut, and I was alone. Panic surged through me as I ran to the door, pulling at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The figure in the corner stepped closer, its movements jerky, like it wasn't used to walking. I pounded on the door, screaming for help, but the hallway was silent. The figure was inches away now, its breath cold against my skin. "No one ever leaves," it whispered, its voice hollow and distant. The next thing I remember, I was lying on the floor, the room completely dark. When I woke up, the door was open and my friends were gone. I ran out of the hotel, screaming, but no one believed me. No one ever saw Jake or the others again. Sometimes late at night, I hear their voices, soft, desperate whispers, calling me back to room 306. I know if I go, I'll never leave, just like them. It started on the first night we moved into the old house. The place was charming, with its creaky wooden floors and vintage fixtures, but there was something about it that felt wrong. My parents said it was just the age of the house, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than that. The first night was cold, and the house seemed to groan with every gust of wind. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it. A faint sound, barely noticeable at first. It was soft, like the muffled whimpering of a child. At first I thought it was my imagination, but as I strained to listen, the sound grew clearer. It was crying. I froze, my heart pounding. The sound was coming from beneath the floorboards. I wanted to believe it was just an animal or a pipe creaking, but the sound was too human, too sorrowful. I pulled the blanket over my head and tried to block it out. Somehow, I managed to fall asleep. The next morning, I told my parents about the noise. My dad laughed it off, saying it was probably the wind or the house settling. My mom just gave me a look that said, "Don't let your imagination run wild." But I knew what I'd heard. That night, it happened again. The crying started softly just as I was about to drift off. This time it was louder, more desperate. It sounded like a child was trapped down there, sobbing for help. I couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing my flashlight, I climbed out of bed and crept toward the source of the noise. The sound led me to a corner of my room where the floorboards looked slightly warped. My hands shook as I crouched down and shone the flashlight through the cracks. At first, I saw nothing, just darkness. Then for a split second, I thought I saw movement, something pale shifting in the shadows below. The crying stopped abruptly and silence filled the room. I stared at the floor, my heart racing. Then I heard it again. This time, a whisper. "Help me." The voice was faint, but it sent chills through my entire body. It wasn't my imagination. Someone or something was under the floor. I bolted to my parents' room, but when I told them what I'd heard, they dismissed me again. "You're just dreaming," my mom said, her voice tinged with irritation. "Go back to bed." I didn't sleep that night. I sat on my bed, clutching the flashlight, listening. The crying didn't come back until just before dawn. This time, it was accompanied by scratching. Long, slow scrapes, as if something was trying to claw its way out. The next day, I decided to investigate on my own. While my parents were out, I pried up one of the loose floorboards in the corner. The space beneath was dark and smelled of damp wood. I shone the flashlight into the gap and nearly dropped it. Staring back at me were two pale eyes, wide and unblinking. The face was gaunt, almost skeletal, with stringy hair and a mouth that stretched into a silent scream. I scrambled backward, my heart hammering. The thing beneath the floor began to cry again, louder this time, and then it whispered, "Why did you leave me here?" I didn't wait to find out what it meant. I ran out of the house and didn't stop until I reached the street. My parents thought I was overreacting, but I knew the truth. The house wasn't empty, and whatever was under the floorboards wasn't human anymore. It was a warm summer evening when I decided to take a walk in the woods behind my childhood home. The air was heavy with the scent of pine, and the only sounds were the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional chirp of a bird. I hadn't been back there in years, not since my family moved away. Something about those woods always felt off, though I could never explain why. As I wandered deeper, I came across a narrow path I didn't remember. It was overgrown, hidden by thick bushes and wildflowers, as if nature itself was trying to bury it. I hesitated. I had played in these woods as a kid, exploring every trail and clearing. But this path felt unfamiliar, wrong somehow. Still, curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped through the tangled brush. The path was silent, too silent. The usual forest sounds, rustling leaves, distant birds, vanished the moment I entered. The deeper I went, the darker it became, even though the sun hadn't set yet. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, twisting and moving as if alive. My chest tightened, but I told myself it was just my imagination. After all, it was just a path. Then I saw it. A clearing ahead, bathed in an eerie, pale light. At the center stood an old, crumbling well surrounded by moss and vines. Something about it felt familiar, like a distant memory I couldn't quite grasp. I approached cautiously, my steps slow and deliberate. As I drew closer, the air grew colder, and a faint metallic smell filled my nose like rust or blood. I peered into the well, but it was too dark to see the bottom. That's when I noticed something carved into the stones. A name. My name. My stomach dropped, and a chill ran down my spine. I stumbled back, heart pounding. But as I turned to leave, the path behind me was gone. The trees had closed in, their gnarled branches blocking any escape. A sound broke the silence, a faint whisper, low and hoarse like the wind carrying a voice. "You came back." The words were barely audible, but they sent ice through my veins. I spun around, searching for the source, but the clearing was empty. Then I saw the shadows. They weren't just moving, they were growing, stretching toward me like fingers reaching out. I tried to run, but the ground beneath me felt soft, almost alive, as if it were trying to hold me in place. The whispers grew louder, turning into a cacophony of voices, each one calling my name. My head spun, and my vision blurred. I tripped and fell to the ground, my hands sinking into the damp, cold earth. When I looked up, the well was closer, though I hadn't moved. Something was rising from it. A figure, pale and gaunt, its hollow eyes fixed on me. Its mouth stretched into a twisted grin, revealing rows of jagged teeth. "You never should have left," it said, its voice a guttural growl. I screamed and clawed at the ground, trying to crawl away, but the shadows wrapped around me, pulling me closer to the well. The figure reached out, its bony hand brushing my face. The world went dark. When I woke up, I was lying in my bed, drenched in sweat. The woods outside were quiet, as if nothing had happened. But on my nightstand, there was a small moss-covered stone. Carved into it was my name.